Daenerys Targaryen was famously killed by her nephew lover in the aftermath of her becoming Dragon Hitler. And while I think that that's a pretty stupid ending, and I don't think it's what's going to happen to her, it's not because I think that she can or should win the Iron Throne at the end. It's because I think she's going to die just in a completely different place. And that's because I think Daenerys Targaryen is sadly going to die during the Long Night. Because the Long Night, I believe, is the actual end goal of her entire arc. So to properly explain this TikTok is going to have two main sections to it. One of them is going to dispel some of the arguments that people use to say that the show ending is an inevitability. I really think it's not. And then the second section will go over how the story is structured overall and why I think that she more cleanly fits into a narrative where she dies during the Long Night than one in which she goes all Mad Queen and burns down the whole city. Now let's get this out of the way. One of the big arguments that people use to be like, oh, the show, it's what's really going to happen, is they say that George R.R. Martin told D&D, the showrunners, everything that happened, and so naturally, that is what happened. And to that I say, when has anyone listened to George? So while it's true that George did tell them the details of the ending, what they used and what they left out is not known. We don't know exactly which plot points he told them and which ones he didn't even know yet, and then which ones they chose to use and how they bent those. So we can take three different, basic plot points, Dany dies, King's Landing burns, and the others are defeated, and just those core things could be true, but the order in which they happen, the combination in which they happen, can be, vastly different. And there is heavy implication that they will be vastly different because there are entire storylines, and I swear, like half the cast of characters who are just fully deleted from the TV adaptation. So yes, King's Landing might burn, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be Dany that does it. Especially, when we have spent the entirety of Feast for Crows, Book 4, setting up a completely different Mad Queen. For the entirety of that novel, Jaime Lannister goes on and on and on about how Cersei Lannister is reminding him of the Mad King, her obsession with wildfire, her weird joy and thrill that she gets out of it, and it's growing and it's creepy. And you might say that, oh, well, that's just leading to Cersei blowing up the Sept. But I'm not sure that that's exactly what she's going to do. Because with that logic, we are repeating a plot point twice, very specifically. We are having a Mad Queen use fire to blow up and murder a large portion of the population of King's Landing for her own, devilish ends. And so you're going to tell me that Cersei does that. Cersei, the Mad Queen, blows up, uses the wildfire, loves it, kills a bunch of people, and then, 2 seconds later, Dany is also going to become the Mad Queen and then also burn down King's Landing with So more likely than not, the fire and King's Landing is probably only going to happen once, and if it's only going to happen once, there is one character that we have set up for that. Not to mention that there's an entire plot line missing with young Griffin Fagon, who is, invading Westeros and is heading towards King's Landing, with Cersei there, possibly being in charge at the moment. So, if that's what we're building up to, I think that makes a lot more sense to be the King's Landing, gets burned down or heavily destroyed in a great big fight between those two with wildfire. But then Daenerys is going to come in 2 seconds later and then burn it again. What? These story beats don't make sense if we're repeating them so close to each other towards the end in a really disconnected kind of way. The other big notion that I really want to quickly dispel, George does not, nor has he ever had script approval of these scripts. He does not get approval of any of it. They can do whatever they want. He can give them as much input as he wants, and they can fully ignore him, which is why we had the entire debacle with him ripping House of the Dragon over the summer. So while, yes, George told them a number of things, how they chose to adapt those things, especially with half the cast missing, and most of the plot lines severely altered by the butterfly effect, I just don't think that the ending that we got is necessarily the one that he fully has in mind, outside of, some very generalized plot points. Also, go look it up. D&D even said themselves that their ending is very different from George's, so why is this so hard for a lot of people to get? Anyway. Now back to the structural story reasons why I think it makes a lot more sense for Dany to perish during the Long Night comes down to the overall framing of the story. The Song of Ice and Fire, the story of Ice and Fire. I've said this a million times, but I'm going to say it again because people keep ignoring me and forgetting. The Song of Ice and Fire is the song of ice, the others, the White Walkers, and fire, Daenerys Targaryen and her dragons. It is the matchup of these two primordial forces crashing against each other with the fate of the world in the balance. Now, George has said in the past that he doesn't see like fire and ice as like equally bad things. He generally thinks of fire as a positive. He thinks of warmth, he thinks of passion, he thinks of love. Whereas cold, ice, the stuff of that nature, he has always had a negative connotation with. And so, based off of that, I think we have a similar idea at play here with Daenerys. Daenerys and her dragons, these primordial forces of life, are the oppositional force to the others: death, the cold, the long night, this primordial force of evil, if you will. So with that, the war for the Iron Throne is the red herring. It is the thing that people are distracted by instead of focusing on the real danger, which is, death coming down from the wall. Now, while Dany's stated goal has been to, reclaim her birthright, the Iron Throne, and all that, her actions tell a different story. Because on her quest to, claim her birthright or whatever, she keeps getting distracted by her actual desire, which is to basically save the disadvantaged people that she continues to find along her journey. And that's because Dany sees herself in them. Dany, despite like this weird perception that she like grew up in privilege, didn't. She grew up poor and on the run, with her crazy brother who was constantly abusing her. And so she had a very rough and abusive childhood that culminated with her literally being sold off as a child bride, as a slave herself. And so while her, arc of the initial book is basically like growing into her own power and her own agency, once she has it, she starts to notice the other people that were in situations that she sees as similar to her own. And as she amasses, power, she does not use it to head straight to Westeros. She uses it to try to help the people that she identifies with. And this, of course, starts Dany's cycle of mistakes followed by a correction, which follows her the entirety of the series. Dany is trying to do the right thing, and then in the course of doing the right thing, will realize that there was something that she overlooked. So she releases all of Astapor, she releases all the slaves, she, releases the Unsullied, but they stay loyal to her because, she has shown this kindness to them, and in the aftermath of that, she realized that there are consequences. So while the act of freeing slaves is, of course, a positive thing, there are now, like, all of these people who are looking to someone to, like, be able to take care of them, to be able to help them rebuild their lives. So with that in mind, when she realizes that, like, oh, there is a big aspect of this that I overlooked, she pivots. I'm not going straight onto Westeros. I'm going to stop and solve this problem first. Because again, her actual care that she is really trying to do is she is trying to help the people that she is identified with, the slaves who, were in a similar situation to her. And then in her time in Marine, we see, again, another series of mistake followed by a pivot, mistake followed by a pivot. This is her goal. She is trying to take care of these people, and so she is going to keep making these pivots until she feels like she's succeeded. Now, when she is eventually on her way to Westeros, I think we are going to see a very similar instance of this, where the Iron Throne is the goal, it's the thing that she's trying to go for, but then on the way there, the realization of what the real issue is, what the real purpose of the miracle of her dragons is to deal with the others. Because all of her dragon dreams that led her to, birthing the dragons in the pyre are leading her to become part of this primordial force of nature in the world. The only thing that can combat the other primordial force, ice. And because her goal, throughout the series has been the protection of the underprivileged people, I think the natural escalation of that will be to see the world as, the endangered, the vulnerable in the face of the others coming down. And so we will see a pivot from the Iron Throne to a full focus on the others, and what I assume will be the sacrifice of her life in that struggle to protect the vulnerable of the world, the entirety of the world. And because we know from George that the Fagon and Dany invasions of Westeros were supposed to happen first, and then the others and the Long Night was supposed to happen next, I think that's what's going to happen in the book. I think the throne will be sorted out first, and then Dany will die in the north during the Long Night. Daenerys Targaryen turning into the Mad Queen wasn't only dumb because season 8 was rushed, it's dumb because it does not fit in with the characterization or the narrative that the books establish for Daenerys. Now, this isn't to say that Daenerys is a perfect character or wholly incapable of, destruction on a huge scale, but specifically the framing of it as being, a result of her becoming the Mad Queen is stupid and does not fit in with the rest of this story. Since I just hit 50K on TikTok, thank you very much, you guys. Let's go back to the roots of my channel and do a deep dive on Daenerys Targaryen and her role within the narrative of the story. When discussing the validity of Daenerys turning into the Mad Queen, something that gets brought up a lot is Daenerys' penchant for violence or her use of violence within the narrative. I'm going to push back pretty strongly on that and say that a lot of the imagery that people have in their mind, especially in regards to Daenerys being violent, is influenced by a lot of the additions made in the TV show that do not exist in their book counterparts. For example, anytime I hear that the seeds of her madness were seen throughout the series, people point to a few moments. There's the entire Karth storyline in season 2 where, upon being rejected for aid, Daenerys yells at the 13 noblemen or whatever of Karth, saying that she's going to bring fire and blood to them if they don't give her what she wants. And ooh, there, a seed of madness. Except no, that doesn't happen in the book. In the book, she goes, she asks them for their help, she bribes them as she's been instructed to do. They say no, and she leaves very miffed. There's no screaming about fire and blood. There are no threats of vengeance and violence or anything like that. That just isn't what happens in the story. Going back a little further, people also like to point to Viserys' death as, look, ooh, another example of her, burgeoning madness and her coldness at the sight of seeing her brother dead. D&D in one of their after the show interviews, I think after the episode where Dany goes crazy, they mentioned that moment specifically, ooh, the way she looked at her brother while he died, it says something. And to that I say, no, it doesn't, or at least it doesn't say what you seem to be implying it's saying. Because if we look at the story at that point, we have to remember that Viserys Targaryen had been abusing his sister physically, mentally, emotionally for the better part of 10 years. And after all of that abuse and all of that, diminishing of herself, she finds a family that accepts her and celebrates her. And in that moment, he shits on that, threatens to kill her in front of everyone, threatens the safety of this new family, and just on top of all of that is, betraying the beliefs and disrespecting the beliefs of that family that she has found at this point. So yes, after all of that, after all of this abuse and this coming into her own and her own confidence and her refusal to accept that abuse, no, she holds her own and she accepts that this is what he brought on himself and she's not going to protect him anymore, as she has consistently done from the beginning of that book. So yeah, not crying over your abuser's death, I'm sorry, isn't the sociopath thing that people want to imply it is. Finally, the other argument in regards to the violence that I hear all the time is that, oh, well, look at Daenerys and the way that she enacts violence when someone disagrees with her, when she doesn't like something that someone else is doing. And to that I say, what is it that they're disagreeing over? What is it that they're doing? Because again, the thing that they're disagreeing on is slavery and people's ability and right to, subjugate, enslave another human being for their own convenience and, wealth and happiness. So no, Daenerys doesn't like that and fights against that pretty consistently because this is a huge aspect of her self-realization. Daenerys was essentially enslaved. She was bought and sold. And yes, because of her youth and the context of her situation, she did grow to like her, abuser, the person who bought her. But that doesn't mean that it was right. And she internalizes the fact that slavery as a concept is wrong. Crazy, I know. Slavers' rights, right? How dare she? She's so mean. No, they're slavers. Stop defending slavers. It's weird. So yes, she uses violence when she is trying to liberate people who are being subjugated. That is a very important part of her journey because she identifies with the people being subjugated, and so she is going to do everything within her power to release them from that, disgusting burden. And so this argument about like Daenerys' violence, I find very disingenuous because you are like applying a different standard to her than you do with the other characters. All of the other characters exhibit violence. They are violent in nature, but we don't have a problem with it when it's Arya, when it's Tyrion, when it's Jon. But when it's Dany, it's like, ooh, it's a sign. And like, no, it is violence being used in very specific ways to achieve specific ends. And yes, her purported goal is the Iron Throne, but I would say that her greater goal is the saving of people from these systems of power. Even her pursuit of the Iron Throne, the nugget of it comes from what Viserys taught her whole life about the view of the small folk and the kingdom for the Targaryen. Because Viserys, as delusional as he was under the impression that, Westeros was waiting for him to return. They were needing him to return because they were under the tyranny of the usurper. So Dany, in his absence and death, claims that mantle and says like, oh, I need to go back. I need to get my birthright because the people over there, like, they are waiting for me. They need me. And so we see a version of that when she is traveling through the slave cities of Essos. Now, as I said before, that does not mean that she is incapable of making mistakes. Mistakes are a huge part of her journey, and that's why I specifically think that the Mad Queen angle is stupid, because if something were to go wrong, if Dany were to enact some kind of mass violence, I do not think it would be in the context of rage and anger against the people that, she has been trying to save this entire time. I think it would come in the context of a mistake, because that is something that we have seen Dany do in the past. A lot of her journey is her making decisions that are unfortunately influenced by her youth and inexperience as she is, she's starting at a place where she needs to grow. And so she starts making decisions along the way and then realizes that there are consequences to those decisions and things go wrong. And so Dany makes a decision, makes a mistake, something happens, she realizes it, and she pivots. She tries to solve the thing, and that's how she progresses through the story. When she asks Khal Drogo to help her take the throne in Westeros, she quickly realizes the ramifications of that ask when the Dothraki, start killing and essaying all these people in these villages that they're raiding, and she has to, put a stop to it at that point, because that wasn't something she realized would happen. In Qarth, she learns that depending on the kindness of strangers is a mistake and has dire consequences in the form of, like, the whole episode at the House of the Undying and the warlocks kidnapping her dragons. So she has to go there and remedy that and then get the hell out of Qarth. When she starts traveling through the slave cities and she decides, I think that this is my purpose. I need to stop this practice of slavery. She frees the slaves and immediately realizes, like, oh, I can't just free them because now these people have nowhere to go. They're looking to me to lead them. So I can't just, bebop all the way back to Westeros. I have to deal with this problem I've created, even if my intentions were good. So over and over again, you see this pattern of her making a decision. Yes, an aspect of it goes wrong, and then she has to course correct, because that is her personality. I'm sorry. An actual sociopath or an actual mad person, would have gone mad already because she has, been tortured for years, but at this point wouldn't care if she was making these, big mistakes. She would only be singularly focused on her eventual goal. And finally, narrative-wise, you've heard me talk about the fact that the series is called A Song of Ice and Fire. George has said that she and her dragons are the fire aspect of it, and George has also said that he considers, fire to be a positive aspect of life, the oppositional force to ice, which represents death and destruction and badness. So in just the framing of the overall narrative, George has put her on the side of the thing that he sees as good. If you want to be like, oh, well, George likes to subvert tropes and stuff, so obviously, like, she couldn't be, like, the actual, like, goodish guy. To that I say, George subverts tropes with a purpose. Also, this was written in the 90s. The early 90s is when he started on this. At that time, the good guy, the trope, the subversion of the trope would have been a 13-year-old girl. I'm sorry. Like, I don't know how you're not getting that. Okay, I'm almost at 10 minutes. This is going to have to be a part 2 tomorrow because I can't fit the rest of it in 20 seconds. I'll post it in the morning before my normal lore video at night, so I promise you're not losing any content, okay? But seriously, thank you guys for 50k. This is really insane. I started posting 5 months ago, and I did not expect any of this. As a special thank you, I'll give you some extra information in tomorrow's part 2 of this about a fun potential project that I am gonna start very soon. So yeah, okay, bye. Daenerys Targaryen's show ending was a steaming pile of shit, not just because season 8 was rushed, but because the source material that this show is based off of, A Song of Ice and Fire, in my opinion, does not support this arc for her, narratively speaking. Part 2, Electric Boogaloo. In part 1, which I will have linked in the description, I go over how Daenerys' characterization within the book does not support the same arc as I see it, playing out in the show, where the show had her, becoming violent very much from the get-go, something that I personally do not think shows up in the books in the same way that the show tries to portray it. And so in this part, I would like to talk about how the Mad Queen arc for Daenerys doesn't make sense, not necessarily in her characterization, but in the narrative, how the overall structure of the story is functioning and her place within it, and why I don't think the Mad Queen fits within that. At least the Daenerys version of the Mad Queen. Also, quick sidebar before I get into it. If you disagree and want to, discuss that in the comments, that is completely valid and you are allowed to, but you need to do it in a respectful and non-dismissive way of people that disagree with you, or I will block you, straight up. Conduct yourself like a polite adult or you will be gone. I am over it, okay? Cool. When discussing Daenerys' role within the larger context of the story, the place we gotta start is a place that I have mentioned before, and I'm gonna reiterate here, and that is, what is the title of the overall series? It is A Song of Ice and Fire. And regardless of what anyone else wants to say, George has explicitly told us what that title is referring to. A song is a story. A song of ice. Ice is the others, the monsters, the White Walkers coming down from the wall, and then of ice and fire, fire is Daenerys and her dragons. Like, there is video of him saying it, go look it up, it's there on the internet. Now, why is that important? Because those are two oppositional forces. They are forces that are inherently opposites of each other, and when clashing are going to repel each other. And so if we accept that the others, the White Walkers coming down and wanting to bring the cold and death with them, are bad, in opposition to that, we have Daenerys and her dragons set up. And so I would argue that they are the force of good in the universe in opposition to the force of evil. Now, a lot of people want to argue and be like, well, no, because they're like both bad, and it's not that like one needs to defeat the other, it's that they both need to be defeated so that like true balance can exist again. And to that I say, I don't know that George supports that, interpretation. Because there are quotes on the internet, and you can go and find them, where he is asked kind of like the idea of like, okay, ice and fire, these are like the two big things that you're referencing constantly, like, why, what do they represent, what do they mean? And he has explicitly said he sees cold as a negative thing. It is cold, it is ice, it is death. It is something that he doesn't like the cold, and so he considers it a bad thing. Fire, on the other hand, is heat. It is warmth, it is love, it is passion. Those are his words. That is what he considers fire to be. And so if he is saying that Daenerys and her dragons represent the fire side of things, and that's how he feels about that as an element, I'm sorry, but I am inclined to think that he isn't thinking that, like, oh, everything needs to be extinguished, but that one is a good thing and one is a bad thing. And so if we take a step down from, the metaphor and just look at those two things in opposition, we can, surmise that, okay, these are the two things that needs to fight. This is the great struggle of the series, which makes sense because a lot of the series is George's, critique of power, essentially, and how power is corrupted by men and misused by men, and, it blinds you to the real problems of the universe. So as I've said before, the pointy chair in King's Landing is the distraction. It's the thing that everyone is fighting over while they're ignoring the real threat to the north and then the real force that is going to have to fight that in Daenerys. Now, not Daenerys alone. She's going to be on the side of the living because, again, fire, the living. So I'm assuming most of the living is going to, coalesce to fight against the cold and death, yada, yada. So since we want the living to live and she is representing fire, representing life, I think she is squarely placed on the side of the positive, if you will. Doesn't mean that there can't be mistakes along the way, because, you know, of course, George likes to play with the realism of characters, the real, like, results and consequences of actions. So will everything be smooth? Absolutely not. I do not think it will. But there's an over-reliance in the fandom of wanting to label a lot of the people, especially the people that, you know, you might not care for, as gray characters, and say, like, ooh, Daenerys is gray, so it makes sense that, like, yeah, she's kind of good for a second and then she goes really bad. And, like, no, I don't think that's George's point, sorry. Because as George shows through, you know, multiple characters in the text, he is going for realism. He wants to show that actions have consequences, that there is a logic to things. So it's less that everyone is in the middle and then, you know, can, like, fall back and forth between, like, you know, good and bad. It's that people generally exist somewhere on the spectrum, and sometimes they get pulled a little further in one direction, sometimes they get pulled a little further in the other. Jon Snow can lean mostly good and then occasionally do some shitty things in the context of the real world, but that doesn't mean that he's a gray character that has suddenly switched and is evil now. It's like, no, there are complicated decisions to be made in the world, and he made one. Inversely, you have someone like Tyrion. Tyrion, who has a lot of villainous qualities to him, who George has called a villain, but a fun villain, and you watch as he gets pulled, you know, kind of towards the light, if you will. Like, he tries to do the good thing, but then some of his internal nature yanks him back a little bit, which is a brilliant move to do within the context of the Lannister family, because the Lannisters are, for the most part, villains, but then you have, you know, some middle ground in them. You have moments where they are better, or where some of them, like, act a little better. I also think this fits in with the fire and ice metaphor. One is generally bad, one is generally good, but that doesn't mean that, you know, there isn't some room for them to, like, move back and forth. So I will never say that Daenerys is a perfect character, incapable of making mistakes. I think that's her entire point. She makes mistakes, but then she wants to correct them because that is her background being her family. The Targaryens made lots of mistakes and leaned into it, and she is the antithesis of her family. She is trying to be different. She hasn't, like, fully bought in to like, this Targaryen superiority, and is, like, not always trusting herself. She will do something trying to do the right thing, see it goes wrong, and then says, okay, how do I pivot, instead of just being like, things happen, which is what a lot of her family in the past would have done. Now, within the context of the narrative, let's touch on the Targaryens a little bit, because Dany is the last of the Targaryen lines. Yes, there is probably also Jon, though he would be a bastard at this point. Go watch one of my other videos if you don't believe me. But George has said, you know, he wrote the entire background for the Targaryen dynasty, all, you know, to help support her characterization. And he does so in a very interesting way. He shows this dynasty of this family where you can see basically, like, every way that they can go wrong, and then every way that they can, like, kind of go right, and they are all lessons for this one individual. And so she moves through the world with the knowledge of her family as an ever-present thing. As she learns more about her family, she adjusts, she pivots, she realizes that there's complexity in things, and that she needs to absorb more and, you know, factor in more things when she's, you know, making the decisions as a queen. Not something you would expect in a narcissist, I'm sorry. And then, of course, there is the logic of the survival of her family in the first place. The Targaryens survived the doom of Valyria. They're the only dragon-riding family and dragons to survive, and we need to ask ourselves, why? George gave House of the Dragon the idea of the Song of Ice and Fire being a vision that Aegon the Conqueror had, the implication being the Targaryens needed to survive the doom so that they could exist to help stop the Long Night. But if Dany is the real danger, as the Mad Queen angle posits, how does that make sense? It would have been better had the Targaryens not survived, and then they wouldn't have inadvertently caused the second Long Night that, you know, she then needed to fix, only to then be put down because, you know, she's gone cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. In the Mad Queen narrative, what is the point of her, and what is the point of the dragons? The two things that supposedly the Targaryen survival needed to happen so that, you know, they could survive. But if she's a monster and the dragons are also monsters, why? And I would posit the why is because they are needed to end the long night, and that is her actual storyline. That is her actual purpose, because she is the fire in A Song of Ice and Fire. She is the thing that needs to stand against the long night, against the others in ice and death. So no, I don't think the point of Daenerys Targaryen is that she needs to win or be the girl boss or be the queen at the end of the day. No, her family survived. She survived. She brings back dragons into the world in a miracle. George calls it a miracle, all for the purposes of fighting for the side of life and then probably sacrificing herself in that fight, probably along with Jon Snow, if we're being for real, because what's the point of him being a Targaryen either? They are needed for this singular purpose, and then they're done. And I'm done too. Okay, goodbye.